We often move through our days carrying a heavy burden that we rarely question, a persistent sense of an unchanging center that defines who we are. This internal pilot seems to be the one making decisions, feeling the pain of rejection, and striving for a future that never quite feels secure enough. However, when we look closer at this perceived core, we find it is less like a solid diamond and more like a shifting mist. The ancient wisdom of the Buddha suggests that our greatest source of suffering is not what happens to us, but the rigid way we cling to this illusion of a permanent self. By understanding the concept of anatta, or non-self, we can begin to unravel the knots of selfishness that bind us to anxiety and dissatisfaction. This journey is not about losing your identity, but about gaining a profound freedom from the narrow walls of the ego. To understand why we are so deeply invested in the idea of a self, we must first look at the long history of our biological ancestors. Evolutionary psychology teaches us that the mind did not evolve to see the truth, but to survive and reproduce in a world of scarce resources. Nature designed us to be self-centered because those who prioritize their own hunger, their own safety, and their own status were the ones who lived long enough to pass on their genes. This ancient programming creates a powerful illusion of a central commander inside the head, a protagonist in a story that is always about me. We are born with a biological bias that whispers that we are the most important thing in the universe, leading us to view every person and event through the lens of how it benefits or threatens our existence. This instinctual selfishness is not a moral failing, but a survival strategy that has become outdated in our modern, interconnected world. When we feel a surge of anger because someone cut us off in traffic, or a pang of jealousy when a colleague receives praise, we are experiencing the reactive patterns of a brain trying to protect a territory that does not actually exist. The ego acts as a fortress, constantly scanning the horizon for threats to its perceived importance. Yet, this fortress is also a prison. The more we defend the boundaries of the self, the more isolated and anxious we become. We spend our lives decorating the interior of this prison, hoping that enough wealth, fame, or validation will finally make the inhabitant feel safe. But the inhabitant is a ghost. This realization is the beginning of a deeper clarity. If we can see that our selfishness is merely a product of ancient biological conditioning, we can start to hold our impulses with more grace and less judgment. We begin to recognize that the voice in our head saying, "I want," "I need," and "I must have," is just a repetitive loop of evolutionary software. Breaking free from this loop requires us to question the very foundation of who we think we are. We must ask ourselves if there is truly a permanent entity behind our thoughts and feelings, or if we are merely a collection of changing processes. The Buddha invited us to investigate this through direct observation, rather than blind faith. He pointed out that everything we call the self is subject to change, and therefore cannot be a stable source of lasting happiness. When we stop identifying so strongly with every passing thought and emotion, the walls of the fortress begin to crumble. We realize that the energy we spent defending our ego was actually the very thing preventing us from experiencing a sense of connection with the rest of life. This shift in perspective is the essence of survival in a spiritual sense, moving from the narrow interests of the individual to the expansive reality of the whole. It is a transition from being a fearful defender of a small island to becoming the ocean itself. This transformation does not happen overnight, but through the patient work of seeing through the illusions that our biology has placed before our eyes. By understanding the root of our selfishness, we can begin to cultivate a mind that is no longer a slave to its primitive instincts. The heart of the Buddhist teaching on anatta lies in the careful analysis of what we actually mean when we use the word I. If we look closely at our experience, we find that what we call the self is actually a collection of 5 changing components, often referred to as the aggregates. First, there is the physical body, which is constantly aging, changing its cells, and reacting to the environment. Second, there are feelings, the basic tones of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral that arise with every experience. Third, there is perception, the way our mind labels and recognizes things based on past memories. Fourth, there are mental formations, the complex web of habits, intentions, and emotional reactions that drive our behavior. Finally, there is consciousness, the quality of awareness that knows these other 4 components. When we search through these 5 areas, we cannot find a single thing that is permanent, independent, or truly under our total control. The body gets sick against our will, feelings arise without our permission, and thoughts appear like clouds in the sky. If there were a true self, it would be the master of these things, but instead, we find only a dance of causes and conditions. This realization is not meant to make us feel empty or nihilistic, but to bring us into a state of deep clarity. We begin to see that the self is not a noun, but a verb. It is a process of selfing that the mind does repeatedly, moment by moment. Just as a river is a constant flow of water that never stays the same, our identity is a constant flow of experiences. When we stop trying to freeze the river, we stop creating the friction that leads to suffering. Selfishness arises when we try to grab a handful of water and claim it as mine. We think that by accumulating things, status, or even spiritual achievements, we can make this phantom self more real and more secure. But the more we grab, the more we feel the lack, because the thing we are trying to satisfy is an illusion. True peace comes from the radical act of letting go of the owner. When there is no owner, there is no one to be insulted, no one to be anxious about the future, and no one to be obsessed with their own desires. This does not mean we become passive or indifferent. On the contrary, when we are no longer preoccupied with our own self-image, we become more available to the world around us. We can respond to the needs of others with a natural compassion that is not filtered through the question of what is in it for me. We begin to see that the boundary between self and other is a mental construct, a useful tool for navigation, but a poor description of reality. In the absence of a rigid self, we find a profound interconnectedness. We are like waves in the ocean. Each wave has its own shape and movement, yet it is never separate from the water. By deconstructing the self through this careful analysis, we move away from the narrow, exhausting pursuit of personal gain. We find that the less we cling to our small story, the more we can participate in the larger story of life. This is the ultimate paradox of the path. By giving up the self, we find a life that is infinitely more rich and meaningful. We move from the isolation of the ego to the vastness of being. In our modern era, we are constantly bombarded by a culture that demands we polish, protect, and promote the self at all costs. From the moment we wake up and check our digital mirrors, we are invited to participate in a relentless performance of identity. We curate our images, we craft our opinions to signal our virtues, and we measure our worth by the quantity of attention we receive from others. This hyper-individualism is the peak of the evolutionary drive for status. Yet it has led us into a collective state of exhaustion and deep loneliness. We are told that the path to happiness is to find ourselves. But the more we focus on finding a solid, unique self, the more fragile and anxious we become. This is because the self we are trying to build is a house of cards, built on the shifting sands of public opinion and temporary successes. When we live for the ego, every criticism feels like a life-threatening wound, and every failure feels like an existential crisis. We have become a society of ghosts chasing shadows, desperately seeking a sense of validation that can never be satisfied because the recipient of that praise is an ever-changing illusion. The pressure to be someone special, to be consistent, and to be better than others creates a wall of separation between us and the world. We treat our relationships as transactions, looking for people who will mirror our self-importance back to us rather than seeing them for who they truly are. Even our spiritual practices can become hijacked by the ego, turning mindfulness into just another tool for personal optimization or a badge of superior wisdom. This is the great trap of the contemporary mind. We use the very tools meant for liberation to further decorate our prisons. The critique that anatta offers is a sharp blade that cuts through this cultural noise. It suggests that our obsession with self-improvement is often just a more sophisticated form of selfishness. If there is no permanent self to improve, then the entire project of the ego falls away. This realization is initially terrifying because it threatens everything we have been taught to value. We fear that without a strong ego, we will lose our drive, our personality, or our ability to function in a competitive world. However, the opposite is true. When we stop defending the phantom of the self, we find a source of energy that is not fueled by fear or the need for approval. We can work with more focus because we are not worried about our reputation. We can love with more depth because we are not using the other person to fill an internal void. We can face the world with a quiet courage because we realize that what is truly real within us cannot be threatened by the gain or loss of worldly things. The critique of the self is not a rejection of life, but a rejection of the narrow, suffocating way we have been taught to live it. It is an invitation to step out of the spotlight of our own drama and into the vast, cool shade of reality. Only then can we see the world as it truly is, rather than as a mere backdrop for our own egoic story. Applying the wisdom of anatta to our daily lives transforms the way we interact with every moment of our existence. It begins with the simple practice of observation, noticing how often the mind says I, me, and mine. When a difficult emotion arises, instead of saying I am angry, we can say anger is present. This small shift in language reflects a massive shift in consciousness. It creates a space between the awareness and the emotion, allowing the feeling to pass through us without leaving a mark. This is how we build a mind that is truly unshakable. When we no longer take our thoughts and feelings personally, we are no longer at their mercy. We see them as natural phenomena, like the wind or the rain, which do not require our defense or our identification. This leads to a profound sense of resilience that does not come from making the self stronger, but from making the self more transparent. In our relationships, anatta allows us to listen with a clarity that was previously impossible. Usually, while someone else is speaking, our ego is busy preparing a response, judging their words, or wondering how this conversation affects our status. When the ego is set aside, we can hear the other person with our whole being. We can feel their pain and their joy as if it were our own, because the barrier of self and other has become thin. This is the root of true compassion. which is not a feeling we manufacture, but a natural expression of our interconnected reality. In our work, anatta brings a sense of flow and effortless action. When we are not preoccupied with whether we are doing a good job or what others will think of us, we can give ourselves entirely to the task at hand. The doer disappears into the doing, and the work becomes a pure expression of creativity and service. This is the end of the burnout and stress that come from the ego's constant need for achievement. We find that we can be incredibly effective in the world without being attached to the results. We act because action is needed, not because we need to prove something. This freedom also extends to our relationship with our own bodies and the inevitable process of aging and death. When we stop identifying as the owner of the body and start seeing ourselves as a temporary guest within it, the fear of decline loses its grip. We can care for the body with kindness and wisdom, but we do not cling to it as if it were our ultimate identity. We see that life is a grand, impersonal process that is moving through us. And there is a deep peace in surrendering to that movement. By letting go of the self, we are not losing our lives, but finally finding them. We discover a state of being that is calm, clear, and fundamentally at rest, no matter what is happening in the world around us. This is the gift of the Buddha's teaching. A way to live in the world with a heart that is wide open and a mind that is completely free. The journey through the landscape of anatta is not a path of subtraction, but a path of infinite expansion. As the walls of the ego become more porous, we begin to experience a sense of belonging that no amount of personal success could ever provide. We realize that we are not separate islands in a vast ocean, but the ocean itself, expressing itself in a billion different forms. This realization is the ultimate cure for the selfishness that causes so much of our suffering. When there is no self to protect, there is only the natural movement of life, flowing with wisdom and love. May you find the courage to look directly into the nature of your own experience, to question the storyteller in your head, and to discover the boundless freedom that lies just beyond the illusion of me. Walk forward with a light step, knowing that the less you carry, the more you truly possess.